Some mistakes feel carved in stone, permanent reminders of who you used to be. For 73-year-old Elias Finch, redemption seemed as distant as mountains beyond the Mojave Desert. This widowed cowboy has spent years wandering the harsh landscape with only his stubborn donkey Maizie for company, estranged from his children and carrying decades of regret. But when they stumble upon a rusted shipping container buried in sand, everything changes. Inside, Elias discovers dozens of his late wife's paintings, artwork he thought lost forever in a house fire. Along with the paintings are letters, photographs, and a cassette recorder containing his wife's voice, telling stories meant for their children. But why was this container hidden in the middle of nowhere? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Mojave as Elias Finch pulled his weathered journal from his shirt pocket. The leather cover cracked and softened by years of desert heat and occasional rain. He'd been keeping this journal for over a decade now, though his entries had grown increasingly sparse. Today's notation would be brief, like most. Day 3847. Maizie found water at Devil's Rock. Good grass near the old mine. No strangers. He closed the journal without dating the entry. Time had become fluid out here, measured not by calendars, but by the changing seasons, the migration patterns of desert birds, and the gradual wearing away of familiar landmarks. Elias preferred it that way. Structure had never served him well. "Come on, girl," he murmured to the grey donkey standing nearby, her ears twitching at a sound only she could hear. Maizie had been his companion for 8 years now, purchased from a rancher outside Barstow who'd sworn she was the most stubborn animal God ever created. The rancher hadn't been wrong, but Elias had discovered that Maisie's stubbornness often masked an intelligence that surpassed his own. She knew when. Storms were coming hours before the first clouds appeared. She could find water in places that looked barren to human eyes. And she possessed an uncanny ability to sense when Elias needed silence versus when he needed the comfort of her steady presence. The old cowboy stretched his back, feeling the familiar ache that had become his constant companion since turning 70. His body bore the accumulated wear of a life spent outdoors, hands scarred from ranch work, skin weathered to leather, shoulders permanently curved from years of leaning into wind and weather. But his eyes remained sharp, pale blue like winter sky, still capable of spotting movement across vast distances. Their current camp sat in a shallow draw protected from the wind, near enough to a seasonal creek that still held pools of water. From the previous month's rare rain, Elias had learned to read the desert's moods over his years of wandering. This land that appeared hostile and empty to most people revealed its secrets to those willing to listen. The Mojave provided for those who understood its rhythms, but it showed no mercy to the foolish or unprepared. As he folded his bedroll and secured it to Maisie's pack, Elias allowed his thoughts to drift where they often wandered in the quiet hours, to the family he'd left behind in Colorado. Sarah, his eldest, would be 48 now, probably dealing with teenagers of her own. Michael, 3 years younger, had always been the responsible one, the child who tried to keep everyone together when Elias had been too lost in his own failures to notice his family falling apart. And Emma, his youngest, would be 41 this November. She'd been the one who'd screamed at him the day he left, her voice cracking with the strain of holding back tears she refused to let him see. That had been 15 years ago, though some days it felt like yesterday, and others like a different lifetime entirely. He'd convinced himself then that leaving was the kindest thing he could do, that his presence brought more pain than comfort, that they'd be better off without the constant reminder of his shortcomings walking through their lives. He'd been wrong about many things in his 73 years, but he suspected that decision ranked among his greatest mistakes. The fire from his coffee had died to embers. Elias scattered the ashes and buried the remains. following the desert. Etiquette he'd learned from old-timers who'd taught him how to move through this landscape without leaving scars. Leave no trace, take only memories, give back more than you take. Simple rules that had guided his wandering years. Maizie snorted and shook her head, her signal that she was ready to move. The donkey had little patience for extended stops once. The sun reached a certain angle. She'd mapped their routine as precisely as any GPS, understanding instinctively that traveling during the cooler hours meant less stress for both of them. All right, Elias said, checking her pack one. Final time, no need to get pushy about it. The pack contained everything they needed for extended desert travel. Water containers, basic medical supplies, tools for minor repairs, dried food that would last for weeks, and a small collection of books he'd accumulated over the years. Mostly poetry and philosophy, words that helped him make sense of the space between regret and acceptance that he'd been occupying for so long. They moved northeast across country that shifted gradually from sandy washes to rocky outcropping. Elias had no specific destination in mind, following instead the pattern he'd developed over the years, seeking water, avoiding populated areas, staying clear of main roads where possible. The desert held thousands of places where a man could disappear completely, and Elias had found most of them. The morning passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the soft sound of Maisie's hooves on stone and sand, the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead, and the whisper of wind through creosote and sage. Elias had grown to love this quiet, the way it allowed thoughts to settle naturally, instead of churning endlessly like they had during his drinking years. Out here, problems became manageable. Perspective came easier when measured against the vast scale of stone and sky. By midday, they'd covered nearly 6 miles, following game trails and dry creek beds that provided easier passage through the increasingly rocky terrain. The sun had grown fierce enough that Maizie began seeking shade whenever possible, a signal that they should find shelter for the hottest part of the day. That's when Elias spotted the glint of metal in the distance. At first, he dismissed it as another piece of desert debris. The Mojave was littered with remnants of human passage, from rusted car parts to abandoned mining equipment. But something about this reflection bothered him. It was too large, too regular in shape to be natural, and positioned in a place where nothing should reasonably be. "What do you think, girl?" he asked Maizie, who had stopped walking and stood with her ears pricked forward, studying the distant object with the same curiosity that had caught Elias's attention. They approached slowly, following Elias's ingrained caution about anything unexpected in the desert. Too many ways for curiosity to turn dangerous out here. Unstable ground, hidden wildlife, old mine shafts that opened suddenly beneath unwary feet. But as they drew closer, the object's nature became clear, a shipping container, rust-red and partially buried in sand that had accumulated around its base over what appeared to be many years. The metal surface bore the scars of wind-blown sand and extreme temperature changes, but the structure remained intact. Most puzzling of all, it sat miles from any road that could have supported the equipment needed to transport such a massive object. Elias pulled the journal from his pocket and made his first substantial entry in months. Day 3847, found shipping container approximately 15 miles northeast of Devil's Rock. No tracks, no access road visible. Container appears weathered but intact, Maizie nervous about approach. Indeed, the donkey had grown increasingly skittish. As they'd drawn closer, her usual confidence replaced by an alertness that suggested she sensed something Elias couldn't yet identify. He'd learned to trust her instincts about potential danger, but his own curiosity had been sparked in a way he hadn't experienced for years. The container sat alone in a natural depression surrounded by low hills, as if someone had wanted to hide it from casual observation. Sand had drifted against the eastern side, creating a natural ramp that might allow access to what appeared to be a door at the container's end. But the lock mechanism was hidden beneath years of accumulated sand and debris. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Elias made camp a safe distance from the mysterious container, his mind churning with questions he hadn't asked himself in years. Who would go to the trouble of hiding a shipping container in one of the most remote areas of the Mojave? What could be valuable enough to justify such elaborate concealment? And why did the sight of it trigger a strange sense of recognition, as if somewhere in the depths of his memory lay a connection he couldn't quite grasp? That night, as he sat by his small fire and listened to Maisie's steady breathing, Elias found himself thinking not about the container itself, but about the feeling it had awakened in him, a sense of possibility he'd thought permanently buried beneath years of self-imposed exile. For the first time in longer than he could remember, tomorrow held the promise of discovery rather than simply another day of wandering through familiar emptiness. The dawn light revealed what Elias had missed in his initial inspection. A series of numbers stenciled on the container's side, faded but still legible. Ahoe 7749B. Below that, in smaller lettering, Denver Freight Consolidated. His heart began to beat faster, though he couldn't immediately explain why those words unsettled him. Maizie remained at their camp, refusing to approach the container, despite Elias's gentle coaxing. Her ears lay flat against her head, and she pawed the ground with obvious agitation. In 8 years together, he'd never seen her react this way to an inanimate object. "All right, girl. You stay there. I'll take a look." The sand had packed hard around the container's locking mechanism, but Elias found that patient work with his pocket knife could chip away enough debris to examine the latch. To his surprise, the lock hung open, secured only by rust and accumulated grime. Someone had been here before him, though the tracks had long since been erased by wind and weather. The door proved heavier than expected, its hinges protesting with metallic groans that echoed across the desert silence. As it swung open, a wave of stale air escaped, carrying scents that made Elias's knees nearly buckle. Turpentine, canvas, and beneath it all, the faint trace of jasmine perfume that had been Catherine's signature scent for 37 years. Of marriage. Inside the container, shafts of sunlight illuminated a scene that defied belief. Dozens of paintings leaned against the metal walls, carefully wrapped in protective plastic and separated by foam padding. Boxes of various sizes occupied the remaining space, each labeled in handwriting he recognized as clearly as his own. Catherine's careful script, precise and flowing, marking contents with dates that ranged from 1975 to 2003, the year before she died. Elias stepped inside on unsteady legs, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. The first painting he could see, clearly, was a landscape of the Colorado ranch where they'd raised their children, painted from the kitchen window where Catherine had stood every morning while making coffee. She'd captured the way the light fell across the pasture at dawn, the old barn leaning slightly to one side, the fence line where their horses used to gather. He'd believed all of her artwork had been destroyed in the house fire 18 months after her death. The flames had taken everything: furniture, photographs, clothing, and the studio where Catherine had spent countless hours bringing beauty to life on canvas. He'd been too drunk and too deep in grief to save anything meaningful, had arrived home to find firefighters already declaring the structure a total loss. But here, impossibly, was her life's work, intact. With trembling hands, Elias unwrapped painting after painting. Portraits of their children at various ages. Sarah as a gap-toothed 7-year-old, Michael concentrating intensely on homework at the kitchen table, Emma dancing in the backyard in a yellow sundress that had been her favorite. There were scenes from their ranch life, cattle drives, spring roundups, quiet moments of horses grazing in evening light. And there were paintings of him, though he barely recognized the man Catherine had seen. Younger, happier, before disappointment. And alcohol had carved lines of bitterness into his features. One painting stopped him completely. It showed their entire family gathered around the Christmas tree in 1998, the last holiday they'd all spent together before everything began to unravel. Catherine had painted it from memory, capturing not just their physical appearance, but something deeper. The love that had connected them, the sense of belonging that Elias had destroyed through years of drinking and emotional withdrawal. Beside the paintings, boxes contained photographs, letters, and personal items he'd thought lost forever. A jewelry box with Catherine's wedding ring still inside, birth certificates for all 3 children, report cards and school pictures spanning decades. And underneath it all, a small cassette recorder with a note attached in Catherine's handwriting, "For my children, when they're ready to understand." Elias's hands shook as he picked up the recorder. The cassette inside was labeled "Stories for Sarah, Michael and Emma, December 2003. He pressed play, not sure his heart could handle what he might hear. Catherine's voice filled the container, as clear and warm as if she were standing beside him. "My darling children, if you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer with you, and I pray that whatever circumstances brought you to this place also brought you the peace I've been trying to create." Elias sank to his knees on the container floor, overwhelmed by the sound of her voice. She continued speaking, telling stories about their childhood that only she had preserved, sharing memories and wisdom meant to bridge whatever gaps her death might create in their understanding of their family history. "Your father is a good man who lost his way," Catherine's voice said, and Elias could hear her choosing each word carefully. The drinking, the anger, the silence, those weren't who he really was. They were how he tried to handle losses he didn't know how to process. "I hope someday you'll all find your way back to each other, because the love that built our family is stronger than the pain that pulled it apart." The recording continued for nearly an hour, Catherine's voice weaving stories of their early marriage, the joy of each child's birth, and her hopes for their futures. She spoke with the clarity of someone who knew her time was limited, but without bitterness or regret. Instead, her words carried a profound sadness for the family that was already fracturing even as she spoke. As the tape ended, Elias found himself sobbing in a way he hadn't since the day Catherine died. Not the angry, desperate tears of fresh grief, but something deeper, a recognition of everything he'd lost through his own choices, and a glimmer of understanding about what Catherine had been trying to preserve. In the bottom of one box, he found shipping manifests and correspondence that gradually revealed the story behind the container's presence. Catherine had been secretly arranging for her artwork and personal effects to be preserved, working with a Denver art transport company to create what she'd called a family archive. The container was meant to be temporary storage while she arranged a more permanent solution, but her sudden death from cancer had left the project unfinished. The transport company had apparently held the container for several years, waiting for family members to claim it. When no one came forward, they'd eventually moved it to this remote location, rather than destroy contents they recognized as having deep personal value. The final document was a letter addressed to Catherine Rose Finch's family, explaining their decision and providing GPS coordinates for the container's location. "We understand this may never be found," the letter concluded, "but we felt obligated to preserve these items rather than dispose of them. Art and family memories deserve better than a landfill." Elias spent the remainder of the day carefully examining every item in the container, each discovery adding another layer to his understanding of what Catherine had been trying to accomplish. She'd known their family was falling apart. She'd seen his drinking getting worse, had watched their children pulling away from both of them as Elias's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. But instead of giving up, she'd worked to preserve the foundation of love that had once held them together, creating a legacy that could outlast whatever destruction might follow. As evening shadows lengthened across the desert, Elias sat in the container's doorway, Catherine's cassette recorder in his hands, watching Maizie graze peacefully in the distance. The donkey had finally approached, apparently sensing that whatever had troubled her about this place had been resolved by Elias's discovery. For the first time in 15 years, Elias felt the stirrings of purpose beyond simple survival. Catherine had created this treasure trove not for him, but for their children who had every reason to believe their family's history had been destroyed, who had grown up thinking their mother's artistic legacy was lost forever. The question that haunted him as darkness fell was whether he had the courage to do what Catherine had clearly intended: return these precious memories to the people who deserved them, even if it meant facing the consequences of 15 years of absence and silence. Elias spent a sleepless night at his camp, Catherine's voice echoing in his thoughts like a conversation suspended across 20 years. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face as it appeared in the self-portrait she'd painted in 2002, tired but determined, her dark hair showing the first threads of silver, her brown eyes holding a sadness she'd tried to hide from the family she was leaving behind. Dawn brought practical considerations that helped quiet the emotional storm. The container's contents couldn't remain in the desert indefinitely. The dry climate had preserved everything remarkably well, but summer temperatures in the Mojave could reach levels that would damage canvas and photograph paper. More importantly, these items belonged with his children, not mouldering in a metal box where they might never be found again. But the thought of approaching Sarah, Michael, and Emma, after 15 years of silence, made his chest tighten with anxiety he hadn't felt since his drinking days. What right did he have to walk back into their lives? What if they'd built happiness that his presence would only disrupt? The questions multiplied like desert weeds after rare rain, threatening to overwhelm his newfound sense of purpose. Maizie sensed his agitation and refused to wander far from camp, staying close enough that her presence provided comfort without crowding. She'd learned to read his moods with the precision of a barometer, adjusting her behavior accordingly. This morning, she seemed to understand that he needed the reassurance of her company while he wrestled with decisions that would affect more lives than just his own. In one of the boxes, Elias had found 3 sealed envelopes, each bearing the name of one of his children in Catherine's careful handwriting. Below each name, she'd written, "To be opened when you're ready to remember us." As we really were. The letters had been sealed with red wax, stamped with the impression of Catherine's wedding ring, a detail that suggested how carefully she'd planned this moment, even knowing she might not live to see it fulfilled. The letters represented both an opportunity and a burden. Catherine had clearly intended them as a bridge between the family's happy past and whatever future might be possible, but they also highlighted the weight of responsibility Elias now carried. He was the messenger for words Catherine had never been able to speak, the custodian of memories that belonged to people who might not want anything to do with him. After several hours of internal debate, Elias made his first concrete decision. He would spend the day carefully documenting everything in the container, creating an inventory that would help him understand the full scope of what Catherine had preserved. The process would also give him time to develop a plan for approaching his children, if he found the courage to approach them at all. The inventory revealed the systematic nature of Catherine's preservation effort. She'd organized everything chronologically, starting with items from their early marriage and progressing through each stage of their family's development. Birth announcements, first day of school photos, Christmas morning videos, report cards, art projects from elementary school, high school graduation programs, wedding invitations from friends and extended family, an entire life documented and preserved with the care of a professional archivist. But it was the personal items that carried the heaviest emotional weight. Sarah's favorite stuffed rabbit, worn nearly threadbare from years of bedtime comfort. Michael's collection of baseball cards, organized in plastic sheets with handwritten notes about why each player was special. Emma's dance recital costumes, carefully cleaned and folded, with programs from every performance she'd given between ages 6 and 16. Catherine had somehow known that these seemingly ordinary objects would become priceless after her death. that they would carry emotional weight far beyond their material value. She'd preserved not just the documented milestones, but the daily textures of their family life, the small rituals and private jokes that had made them unique. As he worked through the inventory, Elias began to understand that Catherine's project had been about more than preserving memories. She'd been creating a foundation for reconciliation, assembling evidence of the love that had existed before everything went wrong. Each item seemed chosen to remind their children not of the painful final years, but of the earlier time when their family had been whole and happy. The realization brought both comfort and terror. Catherine had believed reconciliation was possible, had invested tremendous effort in creating the tools that might make it happen. But she'd also placed the entire responsibility for that reconciliation on Elias's shoulders, trusting that he would eventually find the strength to carry her gift back to their children. By midday, the heat had grown too intense for detailed work inside the metal container. Elias retreated to the shade of a nearby outcropping, bringing with him the 3 sealed letters and Catherine's journal from the final months of her life. Reading her private thoughts felt like a violation, but he sensed that understanding her intentions might be crucial for making the right decisions about the path forward. Catherine's journal entries revealed the depth of her awareness about their family's disintegration. She'd watched Elias's drinking spiral out of control, had seen their children's confusion and hurt as his behavior became increasingly unpredictable. But rather than focusing on blame or self-pity, her writing demonstrated a remarkable clarity about the forces that had torn them apart and the possibilities that might still exist for healing. Elias isn't a bad man, she'd written in October 2003. He's a wounded man who never learned how to process loss. His father's death when he was 16, the miscarriage we had between Sarah and Michael, the financial struggles that nearly cost us the ranch. He's been carrying all of it alone, trying to be strong for everyone else. The drinking is how he numbs the pain, but it's also what's destroying the family he's trying to protect. The entries continued with observations that demonstrated Catherine's deep understanding of each family member's personality and needs. She'd written about Sarah's tendency to take responsibility for everyone else's happiness, Michael's quiet struggle with perfectionism, and Emma's fierce independence that masked a deep need for emotional security. Each child had been affected differently by the family's dysfunction, and Catherine had recognized that healing would need to address their individual wounds rather than applying a one-size-fits-all solution. "If something happens to me," she'd written in one of her final entries, "I hope Elias will eventually understand that the children need to know they were loved completely, not just in spite of our problems, but because of how we learned to love through them. The container project is my attempt to give them that knowledge, but someone will need to deliver it with wisdom and patience. I pray Elias will be that someone when he's ready." As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Elias found himself facing the most difficult decision of his adult life. Catherine had created the tools for reconciliation, but using them would require him to confront 15 years of accumulated guilt and self-doubt. It would mean admitting that his choice to leave had been wrong, that his children had needed him even when he'd convinced himself they were better off without him. The alternative was to leave everything in the container and walk away, allowing Catherine's careful work to remain hidden in the desert. It would be the easier choice, the one that avoided the risk of rejection and the possibility of causing additional pain. But it would also mean betraying Catherine's faith in him and denying his children the chance to reclaim a piece of their history they didn't even know still existed. The photograph that changed everything had been tucked between the pages of Catherine's journal, placed there deliberately like a bookmark, marking a crucial passage. It showed the 5 of them, Elias, Catherine, and their 3 children, standing together outside the old barn during Emma's high school graduation party in June 1999. Catherine had asked a neighbor to take the picture, and somehow the man had captured a moment of pure, unguarded happiness. In the photo, Elias's arm rested naturally around Catherine's shoulders, while his other hand touched Sarah's back in a gesture of quiet pride. Michael stood slightly apart, but smiling genuinely, his new job at the bank having given him the confidence that had been missing during his awkward teenage years. Emma beamed between her parents, still wearing her graduation cap at a jaunty angle, her face radiant with the possibility of the future stretching ahead. Looking at that photograph, Elias could barely recognize the man he'd been. The face staring back at him showed lines around the eyes from years of working outdoors, but they were laugh lines, not the deep grooves of bitterness that had developed later. His posture was straight and confident, his smile genuine rather than forced. Most striking of all was the way his family had gravitated toward him naturally, as if his presence brought comfort rather than tension. The contrast with his current reflection, caught unexpectedly in the container's polished interior surface, was devastating. The man in the photograph had been someone his family could depend on. The man staring back from the metal wall was a stranger who'd spent 15 years running from the consequences of his own failures. That evening, as he sat beside his small campfire, listening to Maisie's contented munching of desert grass, Elias pulled his weathered journal from his pocket and began to write with more purpose than he'd shown in years. Day 3/1748. Found Catherine's archive. Everything I thought was lost is here, waiting. She meant for the children to have these things, but she also meant for me to be the one to bring them home. The question isn't whether I should try to contact them. The question is whether I'm strong enough to do it right. The practical challenges alone seemed overwhelming. He had no current addresses for any of his children, no phone numbers, no knowledge of their lives beyond what he'd gleaned from occasional mentions in conversations with old neighbors during his rare trips to town. Sarah had been living in Denver. When he left, working as a nurse and dating a teacher named David, Michael had been starting his career in banking, serious and focused even at 27. Emma had just finished college and was talking about graduate school, though she'd been vague about her specific plans. 15 years was long enough for everything to change. They could be married, divorced, remarried. They might have children of their own, grandchildren Elias had never met and might never have the chance to know. They could be living anywhere in the country, pursuing careers he knew nothing about, building lives that had no room for a father who'd abandoned them when they needed him most. But Catherine's careful organization suggested she'd anticipated these challenges. In a manila folder labeled Important Information, Elias found copies of birth certificates, social security cards, and other documents that would be crucial for any serious attempt to locate his children. More importantly, he found a list of names and contact information for family friends and extended relatives who might be able to provide current information. The list included Catherine's sister, Margaret, who had never forgiven Elias for his drinking, but who had maintained close relationships with all three children. Margaret lived in Fort Collins, close enough to have remained part of their lives even after Elias's departure. If anyone knew how to contact Sarah, Michael, and Emma, it would be Margaret. The prospect of calling his former sister-in-law filled Elias with dread. Margaret had been present for some of his worst moments, had witnessed the fights between him and Catherine, had been the one to drive Catherine to the doctor when her cancer symptoms first appeared while Elias was passed out drunk in the barn. Their last conversation had been at Catherine's funeral, where Margaret had made it clear that she held him responsible for wasting the precious time Catherine had left. But Margaret was also the person most likely to understand the significance of what Elias had found. She'd known about Catherine's art, had helped her set up the studio where much of the recovered work had been created. If Elias could convince her that his intentions were genuine, she might be willing to help facilitate contact with the children. The more he considered the situation, the more Elias realized that approaching his children directly would be both presumptuous and potentially harmful. They had every right to reject contact from him, but they also had a right to know that their mother's legacy had been preserved. Margaret could serve as an intermediary, delivering the news about the container's discovery and allowing Sarah, Michael and Emma to decide for themselves whether they wanted any involvement with their father. That night, Elias made his first concrete plans. He would spend the next day carefully repacking the most important items from the container, selecting pieces that could be transported safely without requiring a large truck. The paintings would need professional handling, but the photographs, letters and personal items could be moved in Maizie's pack if necessary. Then he would make the 2-day journey to the nearest town with reliable phone service and place the call to Margaret that would either open the door to reconciliation or confirm that his 15-year exile was permanent. The decision brought a strange sense of peace mixed with terror. After years of drifting without purpose, he finally had a clear objective and a timeline for achieving it. But he also understood that the next few days would determine whether Catherine's faith in him had been justified or whether he would spend the rest of his life knowing he'd failed at the one task that truly mattered. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams that blended memories of his family's happier times with anxieties about the conversations that lay ahead. In one particularly vivid sequence, he found himself standing outside Sarah's house, a house he'd never seen, but that his subconscious had constructed from fragments of hopes and fears, holding a box of Catherine's paintings and unable to summon the courage to knock on the door. He woke before dawn, his heart racing with the kind of anticipation he hadn't experienced since his children were young, and Christmas morning held the promise of magical surprises. The feeling was appropriate, he realized. He was about to attempt the adult equivalent of delivering gifts to children who had long since stopped believing in the possibility of miracles. The question was whether this particular miracle would be received as a blessing or as an unwelcome reminder of pain they'd worked hard to forget. The piece of paper had been folded so many times that the creases threatened to tear through Catherine's careful handwriting. But the phone number remained legible. Margaret Sullivan, 970-550847. Below the number, Catherine had added a note in pencil. Updated March 2003. Maggie moved to the house on Prospect Street after her divorce. Elias stared at the paper as he sat outside the Riverside Diner in Cedar Ridge, Nevada, the first town he'd encountered with both cell phone service and enough anonymity to make a difficult conversation without curious ears nearby. The walk from the container had taken him and Maizie nearly 3 days, following old mining roads and cattle paths that eventually connected to State Route 50. His pack now contained a carefully selected collection of items from Catherine's archive. The 3 sealed letters for his children, the family photograph from Emma's graduation, and a small painting Catherine had done of their ranch house in autumn, when the cottonwoods turned gold, and the morning light made everything look touched by magic. The diner's afternoon crowd had thinned to a few truckers and an elderly couple sharing coffee and pie, giving Elias the privacy he needed for what might be the most important phone conversation of his life. He'd been rehearsing what to say for the entire 3-day journey, but every version sounded either too casual or too dramatic, too apologetic or too presumptuous. Maizie waited patiently in the shade of the diner's side wall. Her pack lightened. Now that they were no longer carrying supplies for extended desert camping, the donkey had adapted to town life with her usual pragmatic acceptance, though she kept her ears constantly moving to track the unfamiliar sounds of traffic and human activity. Elias checked his watch, 2:30 in the afternoon on a Thursday. Margaret would likely be home from her job at the library, a detail he remembered from conversations with Catherine years ago. If she still worked there, if she still lived in Fort Collins, if the phone number Catherine had preserved was still valid after more than 20 years. The uncertainties multiplied as he fed quarters into the payphone, but he forced himself to dial before anxiety could override his resolve. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. though it carried the deeper tone that comes with age and experience. "Hello? Margaret, this is Elias Finch." The silence stretched long enough that Elias wondered if the connection had been lost. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone preparing for an unwelcome conversation. "Elias, it's been a long time. 15 years, he said, grateful that she hadn't simply hung up. "I know this call is unexpected, and I know you have every reason not to want to talk to me. But I found something that belonged to Catherine, something she meant for the children to have." Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted with what sounded like skepticism. What kind of something? Elias had planned this part of the conversation carefully, knowing that Margaret's reaction would likely determine whether he ever had a chance to contact his children directly. Paintings, dozens of them, along with photographs and letters she wrote for Sarah, Michael, and Emma. All the artwork we thought was destroyed in the house fire. It was stored in a shipping container in Colorado, and the transport company moved it to Nevada when no one claimed it. I found it 3 days ago. The silence this time was different, filled with what Elias hoped was surprise rather than continued skepticism. "That's impossible," Margaret said finally. "Everything was destroyed. The insurance investigator confirmed it." I thought the same. Thing. But Catherine had been working with a Denver company to preserve her art. She was planning something she called a family archive, but she died before she could complete the arrangements. The company held everything for years, then moved it to a remote location rather than destroy it. Elias could hear Margaret's breathing change, becoming more rapid as the implications of his words sank in. "You're telling me Catherine's paintings survived? All of them?" "Not all, but many, including some I'd never seen before. Portraits of the children, landscapes of the ranch, even a self-portrait she painted the year before she died. And there are personal items too. Letters, photographs, things she must have collected over the years. Where are you calling from?" "Nevada. I'm about 6 hours from Fort Collins, if you'd be willing to meet with me. I understand if you don't. Trust me, but I could bring some of the smaller items to prove what I'm telling you is true." Margaret's voice took on the sharp edge Elias remembered from their worst confrontations during Catherine's illness. "This isn't about trust, Elias. This is about the fact that you disappeared for 15 years without a word to anyone, including your own children. Sarah went through hell after Catherine died, trying to handle the estate and the insurance claims. While dealing with her own grief, Michael threw himself into his work so completely that he barely spoke to anyone for months. And Emma was so angry she could barely function. They needed their father, and you were nowhere to be found." Each word hit Elias like a physical blow, but he forced himself to listen without defending or making excuses. Margaret was stating facts, not attacking him personally, and the pain in her voice came from her love for his children, rather than hatred for him. "You're right," he said when she finished. "I failed them when they needed me most. I can't undo that, and I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness or to try to explain away 15 years of absence. I'm calling because Catherine left them something precious, and they deserve to know it exists. What exactly are you proposing?" "I don't know. I was hoping you could advise me about the best way to contact them." "I have sealed letters, Catherine. Wrote for each of them, but I don't want to show up unannounced and cause more pain. Maybe you could let them know about the discovery and let them decide if they want any contact with me." Margaret's sigh carried the weight of years of being the intermediary in family conflicts. "They're all doing well, Elias. They've built good lives, and they're not the broken children you left behind. Sarah's a head nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph in Denver, married to David, the teacher she was dating when you left. They have 2 kids. Michael runs a regional bank in Colorado. Spring's also married, also with children. Emma finished graduate school and teaches art history at Colorado State. She never married, but she's happy." The news hit Elias with a complex mixture of pride and loss. His children had not only survived his abandonment, but had thrived, building the kind of stable, successful lives he'd been too damaged to provide for them. But they'd done it without him, and he'd missed every milestone, every achievement, every moment of joy that had marked their progression into adulthood. "They sound wonderful," he said, meaning it completely. Catherine would be so proud. She would be. "But Elias, you need to understand that they've made peace with your absence. They don't sit around waiting for you to come back. This discovery, if it's real, will be emotional for them in ways that might not be entirely welcome." "I understand. That's why I'm calling you instead of showing up at their doors. I want to do this right, whatever right means in this situation." Margaret was quiet for several moments, and Elias could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background, as if she were writing notes or checking a calendar. "I need time to think about this," she said finally, "and I need to see proof that what you're telling me is true before I even consider involving the children. Can you be in Fort Collins tomorrow afternoon?" "Yes. Meet me at the library at 4:00. Bring whatever evidence you have, but don't bring hopes for a family reunion. This is about Catherine's art and her letters, nothing more." The line went dead before Elias could respond, leaving him standing in the Nevada heat with the dial tone buzzing in his ear and the first genuine possibility of seeing his family again burning in his chest like a newly lit flame. The letter, addressed to him, had been hidden in the deepest corner of Catherine's archive, wrapped in tissue paper and sealed in a plastic bag, as if she'd wanted to ensure it survived, even if everything else was lost. Elias discovered it during his final inventory of items to bring to Fort Collins, and Catherine's familiar handwriting on the envelope made his hands tremble. "For Elias, when you're ready to come home." He'd saved the letter for last, reading it in his motel room in Fort Collins, after a restless night spent rehearsing the conversation that would determine whether his children ever learned about their mother's preserved legacy. The words on the page seemed to reach across 20 years of separation, to touch wounds he'd thought permanently scarred over. "My darling husband," Catherine had written, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to the love that once defined our family. I know the drinking and the anger aren't really you. They're how you try to handle pain that goes deeper than words can reach. Your father's death when you were so young, the babies we lost, the times when the ranch nearly failed and you carried all that responsibility alone. You've been trying to protect everyone else from your own breaking heart for so long that you've forgotten how to let yourself be loved." The letter continued for 3 pages, documenting Catherine's understanding of the forces that had driven him to alcohol and emotional isolation. She'd seen through his defenses to the frightened boy who'd never learned healthy ways to process loss, who'd convinced himself that strength meant suffering in silence rather than asking for help. But rather than focusing on his failures, Catherine had written about her hopes for his healing and her belief that the man she'd fallen in love with was still alive beneath the layers of pain and protective anger. "I'm not angry with you for leaving," the letter concluded. "I understand why you believe the children are better off without you, but you're wrong about that. They need to know that their father is capable of love, even if it takes you years to remember how to show it. The items in this container are my gift to them, but they're also my gift to you. Proof that our family was built on something real and lasting, something worth fighting to reclaim." Now, sitting in the Fort Collins Public Library's parking lot, with Margaret's car pulling up beside his dusty pickup truck, Elias felt the weight of Catherine's faith in him pressing against his chest like a physical force. She'd believed he would eventually find the courage to return, had invested tremendous effort in creating the tools that might make reconciliation possible. The question was whether his 15 years of self-imposed exile had prepared him for this moment, or simply made him less capable of handling the emotional complexities it would involve. Margaret emerged from her car looking like an older version of the woman who'd been Catherine's closest friend and confidant. Her dark hair had gone completely grey, and lines around her eyes spoke of years spent worrying about other people's problems. But her posture remained straight and confident, and when she approached Elias, Her expression held the careful neutrality of someone prepared for disappointment, but hoping to be surprised. "You look older," she said without preamble, her eyes taking in his sun-weathered face and the lean frame that came from years of physical labor and minimal regular meals. 15 years will do that," Elias replied, then gestured toward the canvas bag he'd brought. "I have the items I mentioned. Maybe we should go inside where we can look at them properly." Margaret led him to a private study room where library patrons could work without disturbing others. The space was small and windowless, filled with the kind of institutional furniture that encouraged efficient conversations rather than comfortable, lingering. Elias appreciated the setting. It felt appropriate for a meeting that needed to focus on practical matters rather than emotional reconciliation. He opened the canvas bag carefully, removing first the family photograph from Emma's graduation party. Margaret's sharp intake of breath told him she recognized it immediately. "Catherine had this in her studio," Margaret said, reaching for the picture with hands that shook slightly. "I remember her showing it to me the week before she went into the hospital for the last time. She said it was proof that happiness had been real, not just something she'd imagined." Next came one of Catherine's smaller paintings, a watercolor of the kitchen window view at the ranch, painted during what Elias now realized had been one of their family's happiest periods. The painting captured not just the visual details, but somehow conveyed the sense of peace Catherine had felt during those early morning moments when the house was quiet and the day held infinite possibility. "My God," Margaret whispered, studying the painting's delicate brushwork. "I thought all of this was gone forever. The fire investigators said the studio was completely destroyed." Catherine had been secretly arranging preservation, Elias explained, pulling out copies of the shipping manifests and correspondence he'd found. She was working with a Denver company to create what she called a family archive, but she died before the arrangements were completed, and the company ended up storing everything rather than destroying it. Margaret spent several minutes examining the documents, her librarian's training evident in the methodical way she checked dates and cross-referenced information. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from skepticism to something approaching wonder. "This is real," she said. Though she seemed to be speaking more to herself than to Elias, Catherine really did save all of this. There are dozens more paintings, plus boxes of photographs and personal items. And these. Elias removed the 3 sealed letters, handling them with the reverence appropriate for items that might change the course of 3 lives. She wrote individual letters for each of the children, meant to be opened when they were ready to understand their family history without bitterness. Margaret stared at the letters as if they were explosive devices rather than simple envelopes. "You have no idea what this means," she said finally. "Sarah especially has struggled with feeling like she didn't know her mother well enough. Catherine was so sick during Sarah's young adult years that they never had the kinds of conversations mothers and daughters usually share. These letters could answer questions she's carried for 20 years. "But you're concerned about my involvement," Elias said, reading the conflict in Margaret's expression. "I'm concerned about their emotional well-being. They've all worked hard to build stable lives, and sudden contact from you could disrupt that. Stability in ways that might not be healthy for anyone involved." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying Elias with the intensity of someone trying to read character in facial expressions and body language. "Tell me honestly, what do you want from this? Are you hoping they'll welcome you back with open arms? Are you looking for forgiveness or reconciliation, or just the satisfaction of having done one good deed?" The directness of her questions caught Elias off guard, but he realized that honesty was the only approach that might earn Margaret's trust. "I want them to have what belonged to them all along," he said slowly. "Catherine created this archive for them, not for me. Whether they ever want to see me again is their choice to make, but they deserve to know their mother's legacy survived. They deserve to hear her voice on those recordings and to see how much she loved them. And if they decide they want no further, Contact with you after receiving these items. Then I'll respect that decision and go back to my life in the desert." Margaret was quiet for several minutes, her fingers tracing the edge of the graduation photograph, as if trying to connect with the happiness it captured. "I need to talk to them individually," she said finally. "I'll explain about the discovery and let each of them decide how they want to proceed. But Elias, you need to understand that this might not end the way Catherine hoped. They're not the children you left behind. They're adults with their own families and responsibilities. They might choose to accept Catherine's letters and paintings without wanting any relationship with you. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't just about delivering a package. You're asking them to confront 15 years of abandonment and the complicated emotions that come with discovering their father is still alive and capable of caring about their well-being. That's going to be difficult for them, regardless of how grateful they are for Catherine's preserved memories. Margaret gathered the items and placed them carefully back in the canvas bag, her movements suggesting she'd made a decision but wasn't entirely comfortable with it. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll contact each of them and explain the situation. If any of them want to meet with you, I'll arrange it. But if they choose not to, you need to promise me you'll respect that boundary and not try to contact them." "Directly," Elias nodded, understanding that Margaret's terms represented his only chance at reconnection with his children. The next week would determine whether Catherine's faith in the power of preserved love could bridge 15 years of silence and regret. The business card fell out of one of Catherine's books when Elias was repacking the canvas bag in his motel room, a small rectangle of white paper that landed face up on the worn carpet. Emma Finch Morrison, Art Recovery Specialist, Morrison Investigations, Denver, Colorado. Below the title, in smaller print, specializing in lost and stolen artwork, estate recovery, family archives. Elias stared at the card for several long moments before the implications began to sink in. His youngest daughter, the angry 23-year-old who'd screamed at him the day he left, had become an art recovery specialist. More than that, she'd taken a hyphenated name that suggested marriage, a detail Margaret had failed to mention during their conversation at the library. But the most shocking discovery came when he turned the card over. In Emma's handwriting, now mature and confident, rather than the careful script he remembered from her school years, she'd written, "Container ROE 7749B. Last known location, Denver Freight Consolidated Warehouse, 2847 Industrial BLVD. Contact, James Morrison, private. Investigator. Started search, April 2019. Emma had been looking for the container. Not only did she know it existed, she'd been actively searching for it for more than 6 years. The realization reframed everything Elias thought he understood about his family's relationship to Catherine's preserved legacy. He found additional evidence in a manila folder he'd overlooked during his initial inventory. Correspondence between Emma and various art transport companies, insurance investigators, and private research firms. Photocopied warehouse records, maps of potential storage locations throughout Colorado and Nevada. Most revealing of all, a timeline Emma had created showing Catherine's final months and the arrangements she'd been making for her artwork. According to Emma's research, Catherine had confided in her about the archive project during one of their last conversations before her death. Emma had been the only family member who knew the paintings might have survived the house fire, and she'd spent the better part of 2 decades trying to locate them. Her marriage to James Morrison, the private investigator whose business card Elias had found, appeared to have been as much a professional partnership as a romantic one. The discovery overturned every assumption Elias had made about his children's attitudes toward their family history. Rather than moving on and forgetting the past, Emma had dedicated years of her life to recovering what she believed her mother had intended to preserve. She'd built an entire career around reuniting families with lost heritage, driven by her knowledge that somewhere in the world, her own family's most precious memories were waiting to be reclaimed. Margaret's phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd been expecting difficult news. "Elias, is everything all right? I need to ask you something about Emma. You said she teaches art history at Colorado State, but you didn't mention that she's also an art recovery specialist." The silence that followed was long enough for Elias to hear the sound of Margaret, settling into a chair, preparing for a conversation she'd apparently been dreading. "How did you find out about that?" "I found her business card in Catherine's papers, along with evidence that she's been searching for the container for years. Margaret, she knew about the archive project. She's been looking for these paintings since 2019. Margaret's sigh carried the weight of years of kept secrets. "Emma made me promise not to tell you if you ever contacted the family. She was afraid that if you knew she'd been searching, you might try to use that information to force contact with her. But she's been looking for the same thing I just found. By accident." "Not by accident, Elias. Emma's research led her to the Nevada location 6 months ago. She and James have been planning an expedition to search the remote areas where the transport company might have moved the container. They were going to start systematic searches this spring." The revelation hit Elias like cold water. His discovery hadn't been the random stroke of luck he'd believed. It had been the culmination of Emma's methodical detective work. She'd narrowed the search area to within miles of where he'd been wandering with Maizie for the past several years. "Does she know I found it?" "Not yet. I haven't contacted any of them since our meeting yesterday." "But Elias, this changes things significantly. Emma has legal standing as Catherine's daughter to claim the container's contents. She doesn't need your permission or cooperation to recover her mother's artwork." "I'm not trying to claim ownership of anything," Elias said, though he could hear the defensiveness in his own voice. "I just want to make sure the children get what Catherine intended for them." "I know that, but Emma might not see it that way. She's invested years of work and considerable money in this search. Having her estranged father stumble across the container just as she's closing in on its location might feel like another abandonment, like you're taking credit for solving a problem she's been working to fix." Elias sank onto the motel room's single chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of a situation he'd thought was relatively straightforward. Instead of being the returning father who could finally offer his children something valuable, he'd inadvertently positioned himself as competition for his own daughter's professional achievement. "What would you advise me to do?" "I think you need to contact Emma directly," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the recommendation. "She's the one who's been carrying this burden, and she's the one who deserves to know her search was successful. But you need to approach her as a collaborator, not as a father trying to reclaim his position in her life." "Do you have her current contact information?" "I do. But Elias, you need to understand that Emma is nothing like the young woman you left behind. She's built a successful business. She's married to a man who shares her passion for this work, and she's developed a reputation for helping families recover lost heritage. She's not going to be impressed by the fact that you happen to stumble across something she's been systematically searching for." Margaret provided Emma's phone number and business address, along with additional warnings about approaching the conversation with appropriate humility. As she spoke, Elias began to understand that his role in this story might be very different from what he'd imagined. Instead of being the agent of reconciliation Catherine had envisioned, he might simply be the messenger who could tell Emma that her long search was finally over. The business card lay on the motel room's small table like evidence of a life he'd never known his daughter was living. Art recovery specialist? The career choice seemed to speak directly to the loss Emma had felt after Catherine's death and the fire that had supposedly destroyed everything her mother had created. She'd turned her grief into purpose, building a profession around ensuring that other families wouldn't have to endure the kind of cultural and emotional loss their family had experienced. That evening, as Elias sat in his truck in the motel parking lot, watching Maizie graze on the sparse grass near the fence line, He tried to imagine the conversation he would need to have with Emma. How do you approach a daughter you haven't spoken to in 15 years to tell her that her professional search has been successful? How do you acknowledge years of dedicated work while admitting that your own discovery had been purely accidental? The questions multiplied as darkness fell across Fort Collins. Emma had built her adult life around solving the exact problem Elias had accidentally resolved. She'd married a man who shared her commitment to reuniting families with their lost heritage. She'd developed expertise and resources that far exceeded anything Elias could offer. But she was still his daughter, and somewhere beneath the professional accomplishments and the years of determined searching, she was still the young woman who'd screamed at him for leaving just when the family needed him most. Whether she would see his contact as a gift or another betrayal remained to be seen, but Elias knew that Catherine's carefully preserved archive belonged in Emma's hands, both because she was Catherine's daughter and because she was the only person who'd never stopped believing it could be found. The next morning would bring the phone call that would either complete Emma's long search or complicate it in ways none of them could predict. The GPS coordinates Emma texted him were precise. To the decimal point, 39.7392 again, 114.993 W. Below the numbers, she'd added a single line. Saturday, 2 p.m. Cheeseman Park, Denver. Pavilion area. No greeting, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the 15 years that had passed since their last conversation. Just the practical information needed for a meeting that would either heal their family or confirm its permanent fracture. Elias had called Emma's business number 3 days earlier, his hands shaking as he dialed the digits Margaret had provided. When her voicemail message played, professional, confident, describing Morrison Investigations' expertise in art recovery and estate research, he'd almost hung up without leaving a message. The voice belonged to a woman he didn't recognize, someone who'd built a successful career while he'd been wandering the desert with a donkey for company. But he'd forced himself to speak after the tone, explaining briefly that he was her father and that he'd found the shipping container she'd been searching for. He'd left his motel information and asked her to call back when she was ready. The return call had come within an hour, catching him off guard with its swiftness. Is this really Elias Finch? Emma's voice had carried a mixture of disbelief and carefully controlled emotion. It's really me, Emma, and I really found the container. Your business card was in one of your mother's books, along with all your research. You've been looking for this for years. The conversation that followed had been unlike anything Elias had imagined. Emma had been businesslike, focused on logistics rather than emotions. She'd wanted to know the container's exact location, its condition, and whether he'd disturbed any of the contents. She'd asked technical questions about humidity, temperature exposure, and the state of the protective wrapping around the paintings. Only after confirming that the artwork appeared to be undamaged had she allowed any personal element to enter their discussion. I need to verify what you found before involving Sarah and Michael, she'd said. They don't know about my search. They don't know I've been looking for Mom's paintings all these years. If this is real, if you really found what she preserved, then I'll contact them. But I won't raise their hopes unless I'm certain. That had led to the most difficult part of their conversation, Emma's insistence on meeting alone first, without Margaret as an intermediary and without any promise of including Elias in future family discussions. She'd been clear that her priority was recovering her mother's legacy, not rekindling a relationship with the father who'd abandoned them. Bring proof, she'd instructed. Photos of the paintings, copies of Mom's letters. Whatever documentation you found. If everything checks out, we'll discuss next steps, but understand that this is about completing my professional investigation, not about family reconciliation. Now, driving toward Denver with Maizie safely boarded at a ranch outside Fort Collins, Elias carried a digital camera full of photographs documenting every item in Catherine's archive. He'd spent 2 days meticulously cataloging the containers, Contents, creating the kind of professional inventory he imagined Emma would require. But beneath the practical preparations lay an emotional turmoil he hadn't experienced since Catherine's funeral. The landscape between Fort Collins and Denver gave him time to think, and the thoughts weren't entirely comfortable. Emma's professional approach to their reunion suggested she'd learned to compartmentalize personal and professional relationships in ways that might serve her well as an art recovery specialist, but created distance between her and the people she was helping. He wondered if that distance was protection against the kind of disappointment he'd caused her years ago, or simply the natural evolution of someone who'd learned to rely primarily on herself. His phone buzzed with a text message as he reached Denver's outskirts. Confirmed attendance for Saturday meeting. Sarah and Michael both available. Location unchanged. Come prepared to discuss logistics for container transport and professional art handling. This is not a family reunion. The message's formal tone couldn't hide what Elias recognized as Emma's anxiety about seeing her siblings' reactions to their father's reappearance. She was managing the situation like a professional project, but she was also protecting herself and her siblings from the emotional complexity of a family meeting that none of them had expected to ever face. Cheeseman Park occupied a hill overlooking downtown Denver, its tree-lined paths and historic pavilion providing the kind of neutral public space appropriate for difficult conversations. Elias arrived an hour early, wanting time to orient himself and prepare for what might be the most important conversation of his life. The pavilion sat empty except for a few joggers using its shade as a rest stop, offering privacy while remaining safely public. As the appointed time approached, Elias found himself studying every person who entered the park, looking for faces that might have aged into versions of the children he'd left behind. Would he recognize them? Would they recognize him? The questions multiplied as 2 p.m. drew closer, each possibility carrying the potential for either breakthrough or heartbreak. Emma arrived first, walking up the path from the parking area with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of complex situations. She wore dark slacks and a professional blazer, her dark hair pulled back in a style that emphasized the strong jawline she'd inherited from Catherine. At 41, she'd grown into the kind of woman who commanded respect through competence rather than charm, and Elias could see both Catherine's artistic sensitivity and his own stubborn determination in her bearing. She spotted him immediately, whether from recognition or simply because he was the only person of appropriate age sitting alone in the pavilion, and approached without hesitation. Her expression remained carefully neutral, revealing neither anger nor welcome. "Elias," she said, using his first name rather than any familial title, "you look different than I expected. Older, you mean, and probably rougher around the edges." "Different," she repeated, then gestured toward the picnic table where he'd spread his documentation. "Let's see what you found." For the next 20 minutes, Emma examined the photographs and documents with the thoroughness of a professional investigator. She asked detailed questions about the container's location, the condition of individual paintings, and the organization of Catherine's filing system. Her expertise was evident in the way she identified specific artworks from partial photographs and cross-referenced dates with her own research timeline. "This is legitimate," she said finally, though her tone suggested surprise rather than celebration. "You really found everything. The paintings I've been looking for, the personal items Mom mentioned in her letters to me, even documentation I didn't know existed." "She wrote to you about the archive project?" "Briefly, during one of our last conversations. She said she was working to preserve her artwork for us, but she died before explaining the details. I've been trying to reconstruct her plan ever since." Emma, he closed the folder of photographs and looked directly at Elias for the first time since arriving. "Sarah and Michael will be here in 15 minutes. Before they arrive, I need to know what you want from this situation. Are you hoping we'll welcome you back into our lives? Are you looking for forgiveness, or are you simply trying to complete a task Mom left unfinished? The directness of her questions reminded Elias of Catherine's approach to difficult conversations. No deflection, no polite evasion, just honest inquiry that demanded honest response. I want you to have what your mother preserved for you, he said carefully. The paintings, the letters, the recordings she made, they belong with you, not sitting in a container in the desert. Beyond that, I don't have expectations about anything else, but you have hopes. I have regrets. About leaving, about missing your lives, about not being the father you deserved, but hopes about the future. I'm not sure I have the right to those anymore. Emma studied his face, as if trying to detect deception or manipulation. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because her posture relaxed slightly. Sarah is nervous about seeing you, she said. She's built a good life, but she's always wondered if she could have done something to prevent you from leaving. Michael is angry, not explosive angry, but the kind of controlled anger that comes from feeling abandoned by someone who was supposed to protect him. They're both coming because I asked them to, but they don't know what to expect from you. What should they expect? That depends on whether you're the same man who left 15 years ago or someone who's learned something from the time away. Two figures appeared on the path leading up from the parking area, walking together with the careful coordination of siblings preparing for a difficult encounter. Even at a distance, Elias recognized them immediately. Sarah's purposeful stride, and Michael's tendency to lean slightly forward when walking, habits that hadn't changed despite the years. They'd both grown into the kind of middle-aged confidence that comes from successful careers and stable relationships, but their body language, as they approached the pavilion, showed the nervousness of adults confronting childhood wounds they'd thought permanently buried. Emma stood up, transforming instantly from professional investigator back into younger sister and family mediator. They're here, she said unnecessarily. Whatever happens in the next hour will determine whether Mom's archive brings our family together or simply provides closure for three people who used to be related. Elias stood as well, his heart beating fast enough that he wondered if the stress might cause physical symptoms his children would have to witness. After 15 years of imagining this moment, he was about to discover whether Catherine's faith in the power of preserved love could overcome the damage caused by a father who'd chosen alcohol and solitude over the family that needed him. Sarah reached the pavilion first, her nurse's training evident in the way she automatically assessed Elias's physical condition, noting his weathered skin, lean frame, and the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of either nervousness or the long-term effects of years spent in harsh conditions. At 48, she'd grown into the kind of woman who commanded respect through quiet competence, her graying hair pulled back in a practical style that emphasized eyes that were unmistakably Catherine's. "Hello, Dad," she said, using the title, with careful neutrality that suggested neither forgiveness nor rejection. Michael hung back slightly, his banker's instincts making him evaluate the situation before committing to any particular approach. He'd inherited Elias's height and broad shoulders, but where his father had grown lean from desert living, Michael had the solid build of a man who spent his days in offices and his evenings coaching his children's sports teams. His expression held the controlled wariness of someone prepared for disappointment. "This is surreal," Michael said, settling onto the picnic bench across from Elias. 15 years. And now we're sitting in a park talking about Mom's paintings like it's a normal family meeting. Emma moved between her siblings with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to managing complex family dynamics, though Elias suspected her professional experience with emotional family reunions served her well in this moment. "Before we get into anything personal," Emma said, "I want to show you what Dad found. The container Mom arranged to preserve her artwork. It's real, and everything appears to be intact." She spread the photographs across the picnic table like evidence in a legal proceeding. Sarah's sharp intake of breath when she saw the image of Catherine's self-portrait broke the careful composure she'd maintained since arriving. Michael leaned forward, studying a photograph of the painting, showing their ranch house in autumn light. "I remember her working on this one," Michael said quietly. "She painted it the summer before she got sick. I used to watch her from the kitchen window while she set up her easel in the yard." "She painted all of us," Sarah added, pointing to photographs of individual portraits. "Look, there's Emma in that yellow dress she wore constantly when she was 8. For several minutes, the three siblings focused entirely on the photographs, their voices overlapping as they identified memories connected to specific paintings. Elias remained silent, understanding that this moment belonged to them and their rediscovered connection to their mother's artistic legacy. But watching their faces as they recognized beloved scenes and remembered moments brought him a satisfaction, deeper than any personal reconciliation could provide. "There are letters," Emma said finally, pulling 3 sealed envelopes from her portfolio. "Mum wrote individual letters for each of us, meant to be opened when we were ready to understand our family history without bitterness." Sarah reached for her letter with hands that shook slightly, then stopped before breaking the seal. "Should we read these privately or together?" "Together," Michael said immediately. "We've spent too many years dealing with family stuff separately." Emma nodded agreement, though Elias could see her professional composure beginning to crack as the emotional reality of the situation overtook her investigative objectivity. Sarah opened her envelope carefully, unfolding pages covered in Catherine's familiar handwriting. As she began to read aloud, her voice carried the practiced steadiness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult medical news. But emotion crept in as Catherine's words created an intimate conversation across 20 years of separation. "My dearest Sarah," she read, "you were always the one who tried to hold everyone together, the child who felt responsible for everyone else's happiness. I need you to know that our family's problems were never your fault, and you couldn't have fixed them no matter how hard you tried. Your father's drinking, my illness, the arguments you witnessed, none of that happened because you weren't good enough or strong enough or wise enough to prevent it." Sarah's voice cracked on the last sentence, and she handed the letter to Michael, unable to continue reading. He picked up where she'd stopped, his voice steadier but thick with emotion. "You have such a generous heart, but you need to save some of that generosity for yourself. Build a life that brings you joy, not just one that serves other people's needs. Marry someone who sees your strength and your gentleness as gifts to be treasured. Have children if that's what you want, but don't have them to replace the family you think you failed to save." Michael paused, glancing at Sarah, whose tears were flowing freely now, despite her attempts to maintain composure. "There's more," he said, continuing with Catherine's words. "I hope someday you'll understand that your father left because he couldn't handle watching himself hurt the people he loved most. He's not a bad man. He's a broken man who never learned healthy ways to process pain. If he ever finds his way back to you, try to remember the father who taught you to ride horses and read you stories at bedtime. That man is still there, underneath all the damage." The last paragraph hit Elias like a physical blow, not because of its content, but because of Catherine's faith in his eventual healing. She'd written these words while watching him destroy their family through alcohol and emotional withdrawal, but she'd still believed in the possibility of his redemption. Sarah wiped her eyes with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing tears in professional settings. "She knew," Sarah said, looking directly at Elias for the first time since arriving. "She knew you would eventually find your way back to us. Maybe not back to you," Elias said carefully, "but back to this, to making sure you had what she wanted you to have." Michael folded Sarah's letter carefully and set it aside, then looked at his own sealed envelope with expression that mixed longing and apprehension. "I don't know if I'm ready to hear what she wrote to me," he admitted. Sarah was always her favorite for family conversations. I was the one who escaped to my room whenever things got difficult. You weren't escaping, Emma said firmly. You were protecting yourself, and Mom understood that too. The wind rustled through the pavilions, old trees carrying the scent of approaching rain and the distant sounds of Denver traffic. Around them, the park continued its normal Saturday afternoon rhythm, joggers and dog walkers and families with children creating a backdrop of ordinary life against their extraordinary conversation. But inside the pavilion, 4 people who'd once been a family were discovering whether the love that had created them could survive 15 years of separation and the accumulated weight of choices that had seemed irreversible until this moment. The small cassette recorder sat in the center of the picnic table like an artifact from another era, its silver body catching afternoon sunlight that filtered through the pavilion's wooden slats. Emma held the device carefully, understanding that pressing play would bring their mother's voice into a conversation she'd been absent from for 20 years. "Before we listen to this," Michael said, "I need to say something to Dad." He'd opened his own letter and read it silently, his expression shifting through surprise, pain, and something that might have been understanding. Now he looked directly at Elias with eyes that carried both Catherine's gentleness and his own hard-earned maturity. "Mom wrote about the night you left. She said you stood in my doorway for almost an hour, just watching me sleep. And she could see you trying to figure out how to say goodbye without making it worse." Michael's voice remained steady, but his hands shook slightly as he folded the letter. "I always thought you just walked away without looking back. I didn't know you—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "I stood there trying to find words that might help you understand why I had to go," Elias said quietly. "But every explanation sounded like an excuse, and every excuse sounded like I was blaming you or your mother or your sisters for my own failures. So I left without saying anything, which was probably the worst choice of all. Mom said you whispered 'I love you' before you left my room. I don't remember hearing it, but she said you said it." The admission hung in the air between them. 20 years of misunderstanding beginning to shift, like sand resettling after a disturbance. Sarah reached across the table and touched Michael's hand, her gesture carrying the kind of wordless comfort she'd learned to provide as both a nurse and an older sister. "She wrote about that night to me too," Sarah said. "She said she watched you pack the truck and knew she couldn't convince you to stay, but she also knew you weren't leaving because you stopped loving us. You were leaving because you loved us too much to keep hurting us." Emma pressed play on the cassette recorder before the weight of their conversation could overwhelm any of them. Catherine's voice emerged from the small speaker with startling clarity, as warm and familiar as if she were sitting beside them rather than speaking from beyond 20 years of silence. "My darling children, if you're hearing this together, it means something beautiful has happened. It means the love that built our family has proven stronger than the pain that pulled it apart." All 3 siblings froze, their faces reflecting the shock of hearing their mother's voice with the clarity of shared experience rather than the distortion of individual memory. Even Elias felt the impact of Catherine's presence filling the pavilion, her words creating an intimacy that made the park's other visitors seem impossibly distant. "I want to tell you stories about who you were before life got complicated," Catherine continued. "Before your father's drinking, before my illness, before any of us learned that love doesn't always feel like protection." For the next 30 minutes, Catherine's voice wove through memories they'd forgotten or never known they shared. She told them about the morning Sarah had insisted on making breakfast for the entire family when she was 6, creating a disaster of burned pancakes and spilled orange juice, but radiating such pride in her accomplishment that Catherine and Elias had eaten every charred bite while praising her culinary genius. She described Michael's habit of reading by flashlight under his covers long after bedtime, his hunger for stories so intense that he'd once hidden a library book in his school backpack to avoid the trauma of returning it. She laughed as she recounted Emma's elaborate dance performances in the living room, complete with costume changes and dramatic bows for an audience of patient family members who'd learned to applaud on cue. But the stories weren't just nostalgic remembrances. Catherine used each memory to reveal something deeper about her children's characters, connecting their childhood traits to the adults she hoped they would become. Sarah, your need to take care of everyone comes from the same place as your ability to heal. Don't let anyone convince you that caring too much is a weakness. Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd watched her daughter's empathy in action. Michael, your love of stories will serve you well in understanding people and situations that others find confusing. Trust your instincts about character, they're usually right. And finally, Emma, your artistic spirit sees beauty where others see ordinary moments. That gift will help you preserve what matters and create what the world needs. As the recording neared its end, Catherine's tone shifted from storytelling to something more immediate and urgent. I need you to know that your father is not your enemy. He's been fighting a war against his own pain for so long that he forgot how to recognize allies. The drinking was never about not loving you. It was about loving you so much that his fear of failing you became the thing that made him fail you. Emma reached across the table and took Elias's hand, her touch carrying the same comfort she'd once sought from him during childhood thunderstorms. If he ever comes back to you, Catherine's voice continued, don't make it easy for him. He needs to prove that he's learned something from the years away. But if he's done the work to heal, if he's found his way back to the man I married, then you'll have found something precious, a father who understands what he lost and why it mattered. The recording ended with Catherine's voice, soft but clear. Take care of each other, choose love when you can. And remember that being a family doesn't require perfection, it just requires showing up when it matters most. In the silence that followed, Emma clicked off the recorder and looked around the table at faces that reflected her own mixture of grief, gratitude, and tentative hope. She planned all of this, Sarah said wonderingly. The container, the letters, the recording. She orchestrated our reunion from beyond the grave. She gave us permission to be a family again, Michael added, though his voice carried the caution of someone still processing complex emotions. Elias found himself crying for the first time since Catherine's funeral, not from grief, but from a gratitude so profound it felt like drowning in reverse. His wife had spent her final months creating a foundation for the reconciliation he'd thought impossible, preserving not just her artwork, but the emotional architecture that might allow their family to rebuild. I don't know what happens next, he said honestly. I don't know if you'll want to see me again after today, or if this is just about completing your mother's project. But I want you to know that finding that container and bringing it back to you, it's the first thing I've done in 15 years that felt like the man your mother believed I could become. Emma squeezed his hand tighter, her gesture carrying 15 years of complicated emotions, compressed into a moment of simple human connection. What happens next is that we get Mom's paintings back where they belong, she said. And then we figure out how to be whatever kind of family we can be now, as the people we've become, rather than the people we used to be. 6 months later, Elias found himself standing in Sarah's kitchen in Denver, watching his daughter arrange Catherine's paintings along the wall where morning light would showcase them best. The watercolor of their old ranch house hung beside a portrait of Emma at age 12. Both pieces finally displayed in a home where they could be appreciated daily rather than preserved in climate-controlled storage. The small sketch pad on Sarah's counter represented something entirely new. Drawings her 10-year-old daughter Katie had been creating during art lessons with Emma. The child had inherited Catherine's eye for detail and Sarah's patience, filling page after page with careful observations of family life that reminded Elias powerfully of the artistic curiosity that had once driven his wife's work. Katie wants to paint Maizie when you bring her next time, Sarah said, pouring coffee into mugs that bore the comfortable mismatches of a household where function mattered more than formal presentation. She's fascinated by the idea of a donkey who can find water in the desert. Elias smiled, imagining his granddaughter attempting to capture Maisie's stubborn dignity in watercolor. The donkey had adapted to periodic visits to Denver with characteristic pragmatism, though she clearly preferred the open spaces of the ranch outside Fort Collins, where Michael's family had agreed to board her during Elias's extended stays with his children. The arrangement had evolved gradually over the months since their reunion in Cheeseman Park. No dramatic declarations of forgiveness, no immediate return to traditional family dynamics, but a careful reconstruction of relationships based on who they'd all become, rather than who they'd once been. Elias spent 2 weeks each month in Colorado, rotating between his children's homes and helping Emma with her art recovery business when his desert experience proved useful for locating items in remote locations. "Michael called this morning," Sarah continued, settling into the chair across from him with her own coffee. "The gallery in Colorado Springs wants to include 3 of Mum's paintings in their permanent collection. They're offering to purchase them at fair market value, which would create an endowment for art education in Mom's name." The idea appealed to Elias on multiple levels. Catherine's work deserving recognition in its own right, her artistic legacy contributing to other people's creative development, and perhaps most importantly, his children taking active roles in deciding how their mother's memory should be honored. "What do you think about it?" "I think Mom would love the idea of her paintings inspiring other artists," Sarah said. "But I want to make sure we keep the family portraits and the paintings that have the most personal meaning. Those belong with us, not in a public collection." The careful balance between preservation and sharing had become a recurring theme in their family's reconstruction. They'd learned to distinguish between items that needed to remain private, Catherine's personal letters, family photographs, intimate recordings, and those that could serve broader purposes without diminishing their emotional significance. Emma had been instrumental in helping them navigate these decisions, her professional expertise providing practical guidance, while her personal investment ensured that commercial considerations never overrode family interests. She'd also begun incorporating their experience into her art recovery practice, developing protocols for helping other families reunite with lost cultural heritage in ways that honored both artistic value and emotional significance. Emma thinks Dad should write down his memories of finding the container, Sarah added. She says other families dealing with similar situations might benefit from understanding how accidental discoveries can happen and what steps to take when they do. The suggestion both appealed to and intimidated Elias. His journal keeping had become more regular since returning to Colorado, but writing for an audience beyond himself would require a different kind of honesty. Still, if his experience could help other families avoid years of believing their heritage was permanently lost, the effort would be worthwhile. "I've been thinking about something else," Elias said carefully, "about whether it's time for me to stop wandering and find a more permanent place to live." Sarah's expression shifted to the careful neutrality she used when trying not to influence decisions that weren't hers to make. "What kind of place did you have in mind?" "Something close enough to be useful to all of you, but far enough away that I'm not imposing on the lives you've built. Maybe a small place outside Fort Collins where Maizie could have pasture and I could have space for a workshop." The workshop idea had emerged during conversations with Michael's teenage son, who'd expressed fascination with the practical skills Elias had developed during his desert years. Teaching the boy basic woodworking and metalwork had reminded Elias that he possessed knowledge worth sharing, that his years of solitary self-sufficiency had value beyond simple survival. "The kids would love having you closer," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she was testing the idea rather than advocating for it. "But are you sure you're ready to give up the desert? It's been your home for 15 years. The question touched on something Elias had been wrestling with since the family reunion. The Mojave had provided sanctuary when he'd needed escape from the consequences of his failures, but it had also become a prison that prevented him from engaging with the healing process Catherine had envisioned. Staying there now felt like clinging to punishment he no longer deserved. "The desert taught me how to survive," he said slowly, "but I think I'm ready to learn how to live again." That afternoon, as he helped Katie work on her sketch of Maizie, Elias found himself thinking about the circular nature of the journey that had brought him back to his family. He'd left Colorado believing that his presence caused more harm than good, that removing himself was the most loving thing he could do. The years in Nevada had taught him solitude and self-reliance, but they'd also shown him the difference between productive isolation and self-imposed exile. Catherine's carefully preserved archive had provided more than just a bridge back to his children. It had offered proof that love could survive abandonment, that family bonds could endure separation, and that redemption was possible even after years of believing otherwise. The paintings and letters had been gifts to his children, but they'd also been gifts to him, evidence that the woman who'd known him best had never stopped believing in his capacity for healing. "Grandpa Elias," Katie said, holding up her sketch, for his approval, "do you think Great-Grandma Catherine would like my drawing?" Looking at the careful lines that captured not just Maisie's physical appearance, but something essential about her character, Elias saw the continuation of an artistic legacy he'd once thought permanently lost. "I think she'd love it," he said, honestly. "And I think she'd be proud to know that her granddaughter inherited her gift for seeing beauty in everyday things." As evening light slanted through Sarah's kitchen windows, illuminating Catherine's paintings and Katie's drawings with the same golden warmth, Elias understood that his journey back to his family was just beginning. The mistakes that had driven him away couldn't be undone, and the years of separation couldn't be reclaimed, but the future held possibilities he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. Some mistakes he'd learned weren't carved in stone after all. Sometimes they were simply detours on a longer road that led eventually back home.